It's March 2018, New York City. Beatrice, who has been living in New York City for 6 years, was talking to me about if and how she drinks water. In her early 30s, she explained that although water has been and still was a secondary beverage in her life after coffee and wine, she has recently switched from drinking bottled water to using a Brita filter. I was curious if there was any change, and she said that there was. As a new resident of New York City, she perceived the city's water chlorine odor to be rather strong compared to other places where she had lived. She also felt that New York City tap water was much cleaner than elsewhere in the US, as it came from the mountains, as she put it, a belief reinforced by her many tests of leaving the water in containers overnight in order to see if anything accumulated at the bottom. There was no accumulation, she said, but instead, she said, quote, "It does have a taste, I reckon. It's not that I reckon. I know that it comes from somewhere from the New York infrastructure, which is pretty old, and I believe that nobody reaches the pipes to clean them. Before I purchased water and wouldn't drink tap water because I was living in an older building. And I had this feeling that if water passes through the building pipes, it turns dirty. Somehow it makes sense because it passes through my building to get to me, even if it is extracted clean from somewhere else." End of quote. When I asked Beatrice if the filter of her pitcher needs to be replaced, she told me that she does not know, adding that she does not believe that filters need to be replaced. "I only had it for 1 year," she told me in a reassuring tone. Instead, she had rinsed the filter once. Beatrice's interpretations combined perceptions of the city and her building as old, the invisibility of presumably decaying pipes, quality of water, and semiotic clues about filters. These interpretations and connections traced by Beatrice exceed her domestic space, reaching out to the public water network and its components, and highlights internal tensions and contradictions, thus representing a rich object for the ethnographic gaze. In many parts of the US, large number of residents avoid the direct ingestion of water transported and made accessible through municipal water infrastructures, turning to costly and labor-intensive water distribution devices, such as bottled water and filters. Filters have been used by a variety of state actors, as well as by end users acting outside of, but in reaction to state projects, infrastructural gaps, and under provision. In some contexts, local, state, and federal governments have enlisted filters as emergency interventions and quick fixes, as in Flint, where the municipality distributed them along with bottled water to reduce the lead contamination. In other cases, filters make durable the biopolitical exclusions operated by inadequate provision and plumbing poverty, as in the colonias on the Texas-Mexico border. Often, users mobilize filters primarily for rather minor transformations of the aesthetic qualities of water, such as chlorine removal. In 2020, filter manufacturers even tried to attach themselves to COVID-19 preparedness efforts during the lockdown, as they invoked the virus to speed up bottled water substitution efforts. Writing about agency and coordination, anthropologists Penny Harvey, Casper, Bruun, Jensen, and Atsuro Morita noted that, quote, "The characteristics of infrastructure emerge out of interactions between multiple agents with competing interests and capacities, making it exceedingly unlikely that they will function according to the plans of anyone in particular." End of quote. That is certainly the case with the use of pitcher water filters in New York City apartments. Despite the fact that 7 out of 10 New Yorkers believe that tap water in their city is better than those of other cities, about half of city residents use filters at home. That turns filters into an unplanned mass capillary accretion on the city water infrastructure. How can this mass accretion be understood, and what are the politics of domestic tap water filtration, I ask. Water provision in cities has been at the forefront of the theoretization of power and technopolitics in the anthropology of infrastructures. Urban political ecology has shed light on the power involved in transporting water to cities. By contrast, recent anthropological scholarship has increased our understanding of the power negotiations and forms of politics that expand access to water inside cities to residents on the urban margins. While this literature has proven generative and brought to the fore new sides of political struggle and new forms of politics, anthropologists have perhaps less explored the technopolitics involved in making tap water acceptable for direct, unmediated consumption by urban residents. New York City has sufficient, widely accessible, and generally biological safe tap water provision, yet half of the New Yorkers use filters for their domestic consumption, surpassing in number consumers of both bottled water and direct tap water. Likewise, the majority of Americans no longer drink water directly from the tap, but rely on bottled and filtered water. Just as flows of water to cities and within them across their uneven class and racial geographies are significant political achievements, making tap water socially acceptable for users through filtration is no less of a significant political achievement and site of power, yet it is an understudied ethnographic location. Filters and their ubiquity have been understood as the purest illustration of what Andrew Sass calls inverted quarantine. That is, commodity bubbles based on consumerist and individualized acts of self-protection against public shared dangers. While filters are indeed the forms of cruel optimism, the ethnographic material suggests that they are also a rich site of technopolitics. Manufacturers' capacity to connect to different infrastructural publics turns filters into a generative ethnographic object. The widespread use of filters raises several questions about their technopolitical rationalities, such as, for instance, what institutional gaps do filters bridge? To capture filter manufacturers' connective capacity, I work with the analytic of catch-all technopolitics, which I ground in analogy with the catch-all party thesis developed in comparative politics by Otto Kirchheimer. The thesis, as initially conceived, captured the way catch-all parties cross-cut social divisions by drawing upon vague and flexible doctrines instead of clear, substantive, and ambitious political ideals, prioritizing marketing strategy, pragmatism, and immediate electoral success over long-term political mobilization. By contrast, by extension, I developed the idea of catch-all technopolitics to interpret the way tap water filters are marketed to diverse arrays of residents as solutions to widely different discontents surrounding public infrastructure. Making plural promises to fix a range of public discontents, such technologies offer no single master technopolitical rationality for their use. The catch-all technopolitics of filtration stand in sharp contrast to the politics of water mediating technologies, such as water emitters, as described by Antina von Schnitzler, which describe primarily one political goal. Similar to catch-all politics, as filter manufacturers enter into conversation with many infrastructural publics, promising them pragmatic improvements to tap water in ways that foreground short-term, often imaginary gains. Filter manufacturers enlist three components in the technopolitics of filtration. These are water and its physical and imagined qualities, then infrastructural publics and their numerous projects around tap water, and users and their diverse ways of using and misusing filters. Let me discuss briefly each component, starting with tap water, the very stuff of filtration. Filter manufacturers ignore the geographical variability of tap water composition. Although filters have the capacity to generate trust and offer the semblance of control, their technical properties should be evaluated against place and water-specific hydrosocial contexts, as the qualities of water do in fact influence filters' ability to deliver. This was, in a nutshell, the point about pitcher filters bitterly expressed by Ashton, an investment banker in the water industry in his mid-40s, during my lengthy conversations with him. Ashton saw several fundamental problems with existing pitcher filters, but he emphasized water composition in particular. Water composition and its toxicity vary dramatically by state, region, and municipality, he explained, directing me to the Zero Water Filter website, which carries totally dissolved solids figures, or TDS, for each zip code in the US. A one-size-fits-all filter is snake oil, Ashton believed, insisting that one cannot expect filters to perform well across systems that transport water with very different properties. Water in California contains more metals than that in New York City, he said, and the TDS figure for water in many countries in California is 10 times higher than that of New York. Yet filters in their instruction guidelines do not advise users to pay attention to the chemical properties of water in their area. While Ashton emphasized ignorance, deceiving technological universality, and the erasure of water particularities, his insights underestimated the power of the imagined qualities bestowed on the tap water by the watershed. These imagined qualities and the city's watershed are sites of hydropolitical power. Take, for instance, Sean, a construction worker in his early 40s and native New Yorker born in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, whom I met in March 2018 and with whom I shared an apartment for 2 months in another neighborhood, also in Brooklyn. When I asked him one day if New York City tap was good, Sean replied emphatically, quote, "Is New York City water good? I'll tell you right now, New York City has the best water in the country because it comes from the Catskill Mountains and it runs through so many different rocks, and so it takes up so many different minerals that you don't really have to filter it." Sean's representations of the tap water origins has institutional equivalents. The municipal water company presents the totality of its hydrosocial territory as a synthesis of upstate nature, city culture, high-tech, and security preparedness. Unlike that of many other cities, New York City infrastructure has, since its inception, managed to avoid the water treatment ontology, prioritizing water protection at the source over retroactive treatment. This hydrosocial arrangement allows the DEP, the municipal company, to emphasize the natural character of city water. Such natural elements include the rain and the rivers that feed the upstate reservoirs, whose water is then transported to the city by gravity, another natural process. The reference to nature far away from such a complexity resonate with the notion of natural morality, as suggested by Gaston Bachelard. In this case, association with pristine purity rather than technology and urbanization. The water company's visitor center in Greenpoint, North Brooklyn, offers material semiotic clues about the watershed narrative. Separation and distance from the city are enacted through geological and landscape discourses. For instance, as one moves up from the foyer to the second floor, the name and the altitude of each reservoir that makes up the watershed are inscribed on the stairs. Distance and altitude are features that gesture toward water purity, casting tap water as pre-political and pre-technological. The watershed pastoral and the natural morality of the city's water occasionally encourage the interpretation of tap water as a produit de terroir, local product, a participant in the food politics of the city, mostly for bagels, pizza, desserts, sometimes for cocktails. And as a symbol of civic pride, as you can see in this poster that is iterated on certain subway lines. Let me turn to the second component of the tap water filtration. There is infrastructural publics and their discontents and politics around water. Filter manufacturers attempt to attach their products to many social ties. Filters are successful because they claim to address many threats. Varied, distrusting publics with many different political and sensory water projects enlist domestic filters. Ethnographic and survey data concur to indicate that the negative perception of pipes is the most common reason why people profess to use filters, followed by things like convenience, the aspiration to reduce plastic bottle waste, the taste, color, or smell of water, or fears of terrorism. I allocate space here primarily to the fear of decaying pipes, as it also stood out in interviews. Fear of the pipes thickens an infrastructural public around pitcher filters, making filters participants in the pipe politics of the city. If initially pipes in the US were objects of civic and biopolitical pride, note architect Alfred Law's 1890s tribute to the US plumbing and his description of plumbers as the quartermasters of civilization. In many older cities like New York City, aging pipes had become a source of fear for many residents. New Yorkers' acceptance of tap water and their reliance on filters are shaped by and intersect with pipes' perceived decay. One survey of waterworks in the US reports that, quote, even if the water leaves the treatment plant clean, it has to travel through miles of old pipes where it comes into contact with contaminants, end of quotes. Filter manufacturers intercept and amplify many residents' distrust of water pipes, generating something that I call pipe phobia. Pipe phobia is a generalized, diffuse, and often unlocalizable fear of pipes, mixing sensory experience of tap water, heightened risk culture, and infrastructural opaqueness. Almost without exception, interviewees did not substantiate fears of pipes by direct experience, but rather by assumptions about their building, the city as a totality, and its old age. One thing that I always asked whenever the issue of pipe decay came up was whether the interviewees had a sense of the condition of the pipes inside their buildings and apartments. With only two exceptions, pipe phobia was generic, reflecting rather than reflecting a contained experience with plumbing. Pipe phobia is a form of precaution, in other words, of being wary and conscientious about pipes based on the sense that, quote, a danger is there in the form of a present hazard, yet it is not already there, acting and harming, but it exists in the future and the conditional as a potential harm to be avoided. End of quote. This is from Francois Guéry. Storing tap water in pitchers encourages visual inspection, blurring tap water's messy industrial origins and distinguishing it from the piped origins of tap, as Guy Hawkins puts it, thus individualizing, authoring, and resourcing the tap water. The new and ostensibly modern filters enhance the properties of water. For each distrusting public formed around tap water, including that thickened by pipe decay, filters are complicit with the watershed, renaturalizing the water flowing through the pipes and emphasizing its anti- and pre-urban natural morality, and thus removing mentally the city from the city water. Finally, filters' third catch-all ability is to attract users with diverse technical competencies and widely variable ways of using it. Filter manufacturers do not produce technological savvy users, but rather enter into conversations with residents' wide-ranging discontents about public water. The manufacturer's activity undermines the centralized expertise of municipal water company, decentralizing it and substituting themselves as the authority source on public water. Unlike centralized water production, filters are hypogoverned. Only about 7% of the filter manufacturers are officially certified, as certification is voluntary in most states. Even if manufacturers are certified, their meaning, usage, and associations made possible by filters cannot be reduced or scripted by their vision, thus opening up a rich field of diverse ethnohydrological practices. And there are many cases of people misusing the filters, such as, for instance, in this case, the person who was using the charcoal filter believed that if she boiled the charcoal, then she could use it again. To wrap up, I suggest that tap water filtration in New York City is an instance of catch-all technopolitics. Filters generate social acceptance of and increased trust in tap water, allowing filters to participate in multiple, often unconnected stories and discontents that populate any city's water infrastructure simultaneously. Filter manufacturers speak to diverse infrastructural publics who experience unease about direct water consumption. The social acceptability of tap water and the lack thereof seems to be located in particular components of water infrastructure, such as the pipes, which sometimes become active for their users, throwing off new sites of power and legitimization, as well as ethnographic objects such as water filters. This study also enriches the anthropological understanding of new economization practices around water. While there is a significant literature of bottled water in the US, the parallel rise of its twin, the decentralized water filter, has attracted less ethnographic attention. Like bottled water, filters too are a form of splintering urbanism. Filters displace responsibility from larger political organizations onto individual consumers, posing questions about the capacity and indeed the willingness of the state to provide safe tap water, as the Black Lives Matter movement core claim about making tap water safe and available indicates. Unlike bottled water, however, filters produce ultimately positive effects, reaffirming the redeemable viability of the public network. Finally, I think the case of New York is interesting for studying water system and water networks, which are not prone to breakdown. As water is widely available and is relatively safe, there is something to be said here about how to study tap water in contexts where there are no open conflicts around the availability, safety, and access to water. Thank you very much.